Hi, Miss Nikki here. Welcome to Chapter 13, Part 2. We're going to talk in more detail about each of the sections of the brain. If we want to look at some of the functional areas of the cerebrum, we have to go back and talk about that line. Remember how there's a central sulcus? And basically that's the division line. Anything anterior is motor and anything posterior is sensory. At the central sulcus, we have the pre-central gyrus, and then we have the ridge below it, which is the post-central. So here, the pre-central gyrus in blue is going to be responsible for controlling skeletal muscle, and it also controls, or we could map it to controlling different parts of the body. So it's kind of a distorted proportion map to reflect the amount of the cortex that's dedicated to each part. So you can see precision movements with the hand and the face, all of this motor control, the majority of the precentral gyrus is used to control those areas. So it's called a homunculus. It's a map to kind of show you which part of the gyrus is dedicated to serving the motor needs of different areas in the body. There are other functional areas within the cerebrum. So there's the motor speech area, there's a frontal eye field, there's a premotor cortex. So this is in front of that primary motor cortex that we just talked about. So if this is your central sulcus, and this is your pre-central gyrus, anything outside of that gyrus could be one of these other functional areas. So remember, we have all of the frontal lobe that is sending out motor messages. So it's not just this pre-central gyrus that we have to worry about. There's lots of other functional areas in the frontal lobe. Just like with the motor areas, if we look at the sensory areas or sensory functional areas of the cerebrum, we have to go back to the central sulcus. And if we look posteriorly, here in orange, we have the post-central gyrus. So this is where we're going to receive somatic sensory information. So proprioceptors, that's like balance, the state of your muscles, touch, pressure, pain, temperature, all of that sensory information, again, is going to go to the post-central gyrus, and we have this homunculus. So we've kind of mapped out the post-central gyrus and where sensory information would be deposited in the cerebrum. And then there are also association areas. So just like we saw in the previous slide, as you move posterior, you're going to have more sections that are dedicated to integrating different information. So you can see this somatosensory association area integrates touch information, allowing us to identify an object just by its feel. And there are additional sensory areas outside of that post-central gyrus. These functional areas include visual information. So remember, that all goes to the occipital lobe. We have auditory areas. These are going to process hearing right at the temporal lobe. We also have olfactory, again temporal lobe, and taste that is processed at the insula. So you can see that we have additional sensory areas that are focused on receiving sensory information from very specific parts of the body. Since the brain is very complex, not everything is kind of a straight pathway, right? So we talk about the central sulcus, and we say if it's coming from the anterior side, it's motor information going out, and if it's being received on the posterior side, it's sensory information coming in. And we have dedicated areas for vision, for hearing, but there are some areas of the brain that are going to integrate information. So multiple areas are talking to this section of the brain all at one time so that you can make better decisions. So the prefrontal cortex, this is kind of the front of the frontal lobe. So we have our central sulcus, and then we have our precentral gyrus, and then we have more motor association areas. I'm talking about the very front of the frontal lobe. This is where we have complex thought and judgment and personality and planning, and it's still developing in adolescence, which is why sometimes we don't have the best judgment. Another integrated information area is called Wernicke's. This is involved in language comprehension. So as I'm speaking to you now, your Wernicke's area is trying to process the information. Here's an image from another textbook again, because I want you to see this connection between Broca's area that we talked about earlier and Wernicke's area. So you can see the Broca's area is here. And if it's on the anterior side, we know this has something to do with sending out motor messages, right? Broca's area, if you remember, allows you to create words, to have speech. Here is this Wernicke's area, and it is back here in the sensory area. So remember, we just said Wernicke's area allows you to have comprehension, right? Language comprehension. So you could imagine that these two areas kind of have to speak to each other, right? So you're listening here, your Wernicke's area is working, you're listening to what I'm saying, and then if you have to respond, that response comes from activation in the Broca's area. So there are some areas of the brain that are acting as a way to integrate information and carry information from one part of the brain to the other. The last slide we discussed Broca's to Wernicke's. How is that information transferred? Well, we have white matter tracts, and this is kind of moving information from, east to west, right? Or from the frontal lobe to the occipital lobe. And these are white matter, so that should tell you it's myelinated. So that's fast signals, right? And then tracts, if you remember, this is a bundle of axons. We also have commissural tracts and projection tracts. So again, we're still talking about axons and neurons and how we're communicating within the brain. We already saw the association tract, that was east to west or west to east. Now we have commissural tract, and you can see it helps the right and the left side of the brain talk to each other. And then we have projection tracts, and to me these are north and south. So these allow information from here in the cerebral cortex, which is kind of your personality, who you are, likes and dislikes, and allows that information to travel to some of these kind of lower order areas in the brainstem. Sometimes these tracts or these neurons are firing too rapidly. So epilepsy is a neurological disorder, and where you have action potentials that are happening too frequently and too rapidly, it's almost like your heart beating out of control. In this case, it's your brain neurons just firing without any real rhyme or reason. In talking about how the brain is wired and how all of these neuron tracts are navigating through brain tissue, we could see that if you had blocked blood supply, that it could cause brain tissue death. And if you remember, the left side controls the right movement or right side of the body. So if you had damage to tissue on the left side, it would show up in decreased right side movement. So it affects the opposite side of the body. Before we talk about these deep gray matter nuclei, let's go back and talk about kind of the areas of the brain again. So we have this cerebral cortex. It's gray matter. Gray matter, you should be thinking unmyelinated. Unmyelinated, kind of a slow, steady signal. And remember, this is where we send out motor messages or where we pick up or deliver sensory messages. Then we just talked about all of this white matter, right? And if I say white matter to you, you should be thinking myelinated, fast signals. And remember, this is where we have all those associations. So this is where we have the tracts, how the brain is communicating or integrating information. Now we finally get to the cerebral nuclei, so these gray matter areas within the brain. So remember, nuclei is soma or cell body. It's a collection of whatever term you want to use, right? And these areas are going to be responsible for mood, emotion. On the motor side, it could be like patterns, generating patterns, let's say for walking. you know, one leg forward, swinging the arms back and forth. And then there's also some subconscious control going on here. So controlling maybe muscle movement or muscle tone. You could also subconsciously be receiving sensory messages. If somebody's sitting in a room and they have on a blue shirt, you may not register that they have on a blue shirt, but your vision is still seeing it, and that information is subconsciously being maintained by the brain. Some clinical views that we can talk about again. A headache is due to dilated blood vessels. So you have your blood vessel here and it's expanding, and when it expands, it's putting pressure on your brain tissue. And when it puts pressure on your brain tissue, you're going to have pain receptors that are activated. Cerebral palsy, this is a neuromuscular disorder. Usually there's some sort of impairment of skeletal muscle due to the information being sent from the brain. So something's wrong with the motor control leading to impairment of skeletal muscles. A few other clinical issues that can arise. We have Huntington's disease, which is a hereditary disease causing involuntary jerky movements. We have Parkinson's disease, which affects muscle movement and balance, and you're going to see a slowing in voluntary movements. And so these are two brain disorders that specifically affect cerebral nuclei. Now we move on to the diencephalon. The diencephalon is outlined in purple here. So the diencephalon includes the epithalamus, remember epi means upon, thalamus, and hypothalamus, which means below. So this area here is the hypothalamus, this area here is the epithalamus, and then the thalamus is just the area in the middle. And one thing to think about is during development it was epithalamus and then hypothalamus. But what happens to the brain? It kind of curves, right? So if you were to look at it straight up and down, it would be in the right order, but when it curves, the epi is kind of on the back side. The epithalamus main feature is the pineal or pineal gland, and this is an endocrine gland that secretes melatonin into your bloodstream, and this is going to help regulate day and night cycles called your circadian rhythm. So basically when melanin is high, you are sleepy. Here we have the thalamus. So here at the core, we have the thalamus. It's made up of several different nuclei, and they all have different functions. But if we had to kind of have an overall function, it's going to relay information, specifically sensory information that's coming from the spinal cord and the brainstem. So the thalamus kind of sorts that information and decides where it needs to go in the brain. Also, another important function is that it's going to filter out kind of noise. So any excess information that you don't need is going to be filtered out by the thalamus. I figured I'd show you the hypothalamus before we talk about all of its functions. If you look for the W, that'll tell you that you're at the hypothalamus. So this is hypothalamus. You can see lots of nuclei. You can see here the thalamus that we just talked about. I wanted you to see that hanging off of the stalk, the infundibulum, is the pituitary gland. And we're going to talk about a lot of functions that are directly related to the hormones that are released from the pituitary gland. Functions of the hypothalamus, and this is just the first page. So it controls autonomic function. Hopefully when I'm saying that, you're automatically thinking smooth and cardiac function. It also controls the endocrine system. So the pituitary gland is going to release hormones that control various activities in the body that we'll learn more about in the second half of anatomy. But growth, follicle stimulation, so if you release eggs or sperm, water control, whether we're going to reabsorb all of the water in our kidneys or whether we're going to let it go as urine. It controls your body temperature. Page 2, food intake, water intake, sleep-wake rhythms, emotional behavior. So you can see that this is kind of a master region area within the brain. And then they'll usually talk about the pituitary being the master gland. Now we move on to the brainstem. So we're trying to connect the cerebrum and the spinal cord or the rest of the body, right? So the brainstem consists of the midbrain, the pons, the medulla oblongata. So directly above this is going to be the thalamus or diencephalon, and directly below is going to be the spinal cord. The first section of the brainstem that we're going to talk about is the midbrain. And you can see the midbrain, there is no gray matter. So remember, as you move down the brainstem, the outer gray matter is gone. We do have white matter, and then we have these nuclei. So there's going to be several different functions here. The midbrain, remember, if the cerebrum is here and the cerebellum is here, so I'm going to write bellum, and we know this is the cerebrum. The midbrain is this section right here, and you can see how it could carry out motor messages. It could also have sensory messages traveling through that area. It also allows for the cerebellum and the cerebrum to speak to each other or to have communication. You could also have tracts that relay information from the cerebrum to the cerebellum. We're also going to see in the midbrain some neurons that release the neurotransmitter dopamine. And dopamine is responsible for kind of emotions, pleasure, pain. We're also going to see some reflex action. I'm not going to talk about it now. We'll talk about reflexes later, but there are some reflexes with vision and hearing that are housed, the nuclei for those are housed in the midbrain. The second region is the pons. Again, you can see lots of white matter and several areas of nuclei. One important area in the pons is the respiratory center. So here we have a collection of somas that are responsible for setting respiratory rate. We're also going to see that the pons here helps connect the cerebellum, again, to the rest of the brain. Several cranial nerves, which we haven't talked about yet, but several cranial nerves emerge from the pons, and these are going to carry both sensory and motor messages from areas like the face, from the ear for hearing, for the vestibule for balance, and we'll talk more about those when we go through cranial nerves. Third section of the brainstem is the medulla oblongata. Again, you can see several nuclei, so we're going to have several regions responsible for a variety of functions. One, you're through this part of the brainstem, right? You're carrying sensory information to the brain and motor information away from the brain. We'll talk a little bit more about the cerebrum, but the medulla allows for sensory information about kind of your balance and your muscle tone. All of that is going to go to the cerebellum, and the cerebellum is going to kind of keep note of where you are in space and time. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. There's also a cardiac center, so it's going to control heart rate. We have a vasomotor center that's going to control blood vessel diameter, like how large the blood vessel is, whether it's constricted or dilated. And then we also have another respiratory center. So this is two respiratory centers. One is in the pons, one is in the medulla. Also, we have nuclei responsible for coughing and sneezing and vomiting and producing or releasing saliva and swallowing. So a lot of people call this a primitive brain. I think I've mentioned this statement before when we talked about the brainstem, but this controls a lot of the immediate, functions that you need for survival. Next, we move on to the cerebellum. So here's the cerebellum. We've talked about the fact that the cerebellum is in communication with the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. So sensory information is going to travel through the brainstem into the cerebellum. And I said this has something to do with kind of where your body is in space and time, how contracted are your muscles. Basically, if your eyes are closed, how do you know if your hand is up, if you're sitting cross-legged? All of that is due to messages received, sensory messages received by the cerebellum. Cerebral pathways are really interesting. So let's start with the blue line here. The first thing that happens, you have proprioceptors in your skeletal muscle in your joint reporting the degree of movement. Is the muscle contracted? Is it relaxed? What's the state of the muscle tone? So basically all the sensory information about a muscle or a joint is constantly being sent to the cerebellum. So I think of this as kind of like my current situation. That's what my cerebellum is recording. Now, my brain here, my frontal lobe, says, I want to move, right? And this is where motor action originates from, right? Frontal cerebral cortex. So motor action, I want to do a certain action. That information gets fed to the cerebellum. So I think of this as future plan. Brain says, I want to lift my arm and wave my hand. That information gets sent to the cerebellum. Then your cerebellum integrates all of that. This is my current situation. This is my future plan. What's the best way to carry out this action? So then your cerebellum sends that information through the midbrain, through the thalamus, to your primary motor cortex. Then that information will be sent out as motor action to carry out the task that you want to carry out. So this is a lot of work, and this is happening how quickly? I mean, we can snap our fingers pretty quickly, right? So this is happening in hundreds of milliseconds. All of this processing and integration and decision making is happening very quickly. I'm sure we can see how alcohol and drugs affect the cerebrum, right? We said this is your conscious mind. This is where we make judgments, right? So we can see how that would be impaired. But how does alcohol and drugs impair the cerebellum? We just talked about coordinated muscle action, right? Motor control. So if you don't have that coordinated motor control, that can disturb your gait or the way that you're walking. It can affect your posture, your sense of balance, and then it can also disrupt that sensory information that's being received by the cerebellum, where you are in space and time, right? So this is it for part 2. We'll move on to part 3. So I'll talk to you guys soon. Bye.